Okay, well, it is my pleasure to introduce our seminar speaker today, Dr. Benjamin Preston. Dr. Preston is a senior policy researcher and director of the Community Health and Environmental Policy Program at the RAND Corporation. He is also a professor in the Parity RAND Graduate School. Dr. Preston's recent research has explored the role of knowledge in climate risk management, conducted analysis of disaster recovery options, scenario analysis for a low carbon future, and has also analyzed the implications of shocks such as COVID-19 and climate change for the delivery of infrastructure services. Dr. Preston has previously held research positions with the Climate Change Science Institute at Oak Ridge National Lab, at Australia's National Science Agency in the Division of Marine and Atmospheric Research, and also at the Pew Center on Global Climate Change. He has also held leadership roles on national and international scientific assessments, including the US National Climate Assessments and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Dr. Preston received a BS in biology from the College of William and Mary and a PhD in environmental biology from the Georgia Institute of Technology. And today he will be sharing his research on climate policy. And specifically, his talk is The Climate Action Paradox, Maintaining Well-Being in the Age of Aggressive Policy. So welcome, Dr. Preston.
Thanks, Miriam. Thanks for the invite. Thanks, everybody, for joining. One quick caveat about this entire seminar I'm about to present is it's not, I mean, I'd like to call it a research project, but it's not really. It's really a collection of thoughts based upon conversations I've been having with various other folks, both in research and in practice over the past few years, and trying to share some of these thoughts just to get other people to share their thoughts. And so I'm not going to talk about a particular paper that I published, or maybe one, or anything like that, but really sort of take you through maybe a thought process and then have a discussion about it. So I'm going to try and move quickly, because I do want to hear sort of thoughts and reactions, good, bad, or ugly. And just in terms of sort of background context, there's really kind of two sort of key thoughts that sort of underpin my remarks today. And so one is just with probably a few years ago when the IPCC 1.5 degree special report came out in 2018, I think, it really pushed this idea of the urgency of climate action, the need to move aggressively. And I began thinking, finally, we're talking about climate change action at sort of a scale commensurate with the challenge. That's great, but it also implies, decarbonizing the world in 10 years is going to be massively disruptive. And even if that's necessary, within that disruption, it creates challenges for the health and well-being of people in various populations, different communities, and it's likely to be the most vulnerable among us that face the most the heaviest burden of dealing with these transitions. And so it's trying to sort of understand the unintended consequences or externalities of dealing with the climate challenge in a very aggressive way. And then more recently, sort of in this post sort of George Floyd era, where equity is being pushed down into everything, and we're seeing that. I was just in a seminar earlier today with NASA, who's looking at environmental justice issues in terms of the NASA mission. So we're seeing equity being pushed into everything, but it's not simply a module that you can attach to everything. And if we're trying to address this massive climate challenge, but do it in a way that is just and equitable for all, it actually significantly complicates what we do. Not in the sense of, do we or do we not deal with the climate challenge, but how we do it, how we design policies, and how we account for potential externalities, again, for the most vulnerable. So if the next thing that I say over the next 30 odd minutes doesn't make any sense, hopefully that gives you some, understanding of where I'm coming from. So with that, I'm going to plow ahead and I'm going to start talk at a sort of high level. So it talks sort of globally about sustainable development. So the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change chapter that I've been co-leading is focused on climate resilient development, looking at how we think about climate action in the context of sustainable development. And the Sustainable Development Goals, which are sort of a part of the United Nations Agenda 30, have these 5 pillars. And it's sort of a focus on people, the planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. Those are sort of the 5 Ps. And what I like and why I'm starting with this is the Sustainable Development Goals, even though they focus on the planet, they're very much focused on people, right? And so some of the sort of goals that they're trying to achieve are ending poverty, ending hunger, protecting human rights, protecting human dignity, promoting equity, racial equity, racial ethnic equity, religious equity, gender equity, across the board, providing education, providing healthcare. It's very much sort of a people-centric focus. And really one could think of the Sustainable Development Goals as essentially promoting human well-being for everyone, no matter where they are in which development context. And so I really like this sort of people-centric view. At the same time, they are, this SDGs are focused on sustainability, and therefore it's also a focus on protecting the planet and its natural resources and its natural environment, while we achieve these sort of development goals for people. Now, one question that opens up is, when we think about the climate challenge, and I pulled out the people and planet dimensions in particular because some have argued or raised concerns about, do we have the balance right? And are we doing enough in our fight on climate change to focus on the people, or are we really focusing on the planet? There's a lot of talk about planetary boundaries around protecting biodiversity, putting the planet first. And, if we take that frame, do people sort of move into the background, simply get labeled as culprits in the climate change business? And then if that's the frame that we're using, what does that mean in terms of people's well-being and quality of life? So I think there are these, as much as we like to avoid it, we do see some of these tensions between the people and the planet aspects, and these tensions start to emerge in the public policy arena. Now, climate change is, of course, one of the specific sustainable development goals. So the SDGs put climate change directly into the Sustainable Development Agenda, and SDG 13, which is on climate action, particularly calls out the need to take urgent action to combat climate change and its consequences. It wants to do that through various mechanisms, creating carbon neutral economies, so that's essentially moving to net zero economies around the world, as well as promoting climate adaptation to manage climate risk and promoting climate finance. But again, this emphasis on urgency, while justified scientifically, has the potential to create some externalities if we're not thinking holistically about the end goal of climate action. So now, and putting these thoughts together, it did occur to me that some might say, is this going to be one of those talks a la Bjorn Lomborg, skeptical environmentalist, where somebody comes out and says, oh, climate change is not a problem and we don't need to act on climate change? No, it is not that kind of conversation, because we've known for quite some time that taking action on climate change generates a lot of benefits, and it's likely to generate a lot of benefits, particularly in the health arena. So this is just results from a paper from 20 years ago that focused on trying to quantify the sort of benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in 4 cities around the world. Those benefits in terms of avoided mortality, morbidity, avoided hospital admissions, et cetera, et cetera. And you pretty quickly get to some fairly large numbers in terms of avoided health impacts. And a lot of this is coming from avoiding the direct impacts of extreme climate events, but a lot of this also attributed to improvements in air quality as we shift away from fossil fuels to other renewable sources. And this is just like ridiculously well documented, right? The adverse health impacts of a fossil fuel economy. Fast forward 20 years, a much more recent paper looking at different countries around the world. And I'm not going to go into what all the different bars are, but it's looking at avoided deaths associated with specifically implementation of the Paris Agreement, the International Agreement on Climate Action. Same story, right? Large numbers of avoided health impacts by taking action on climate change. And so this is sort of the basis for a lot of the arguments that taking action on climate change generates more goods than it does harms in terms of the costs of climate action. So this is well established and not pushing against this in any way, shape, or form. And it's a key justification for why climate action is justified. But what I want to do is sort of move beyond some of these immediate metrics of morbidity and mortality, and think a little bit more broadly about human well-being, and also think less about these sort of big aggregate numbers at the scale of a city or a nation in the world, and think about specific communities, think about specific households. Where I'm going with this is if we look beyond these sort of direct metrics, there's other ways of measuring well-being. And so this is the OECD's framework for well-being, and certainly it includes things like health, traditional health metrics, but it's also education, knowledge, environmental quality, social connections, work-life balance. And so it's a much more broader sort of holistic view. And in particular, this is where sort of the equity argument starts to emerge, and that the equity dimensions of well-being are actually sort of fundamental. So the idea is, can you actually promote well-being or have populations and individuals with a sense of well-being if they're living in a state of inequity? And if they are living in a state of inequity, or I guess really the question is, to what extent does actions we take on climate change create the potential to perpetuate or exacerbate existing inequities in society, create new inequities? And if that does, is that a potential externality that undermines human well-being? And so for me, the issue is one of, as I said sort of at the beginning, that if we're trying to take aggressive action on climate, it's not a simple, add equity in the mix, but rather taking these aggressive actions really complicates, policy design, and really forces us to actually think quite carefully, even rethink how we pursue the pursuit of specific policies and practices. And so this notion of sort of well-being as a lens sort of harkens back to something I wrote. This is I think the one reference to my own work, and it's quite dated, right? So this is I got asked in 2009 to contribute a chapter to a book on climate and social justice, and I'm a biologist by training, right? So I spent very little time thinking about social justice as a concept. It gave me an opportunity to think about it quite extensively, and sort of where I landed at sort of generally this quote, which is, if we're thinking about policy to address climate change, how do we measure the success of that policy? And do we measure success by reductions in greenhouse gases? And I think I arrived at the answer to that being no. We should be thinking more holistically and measuring success by the extent to which interventions we pursue secure positive social and ecological outcomes. So I'm talking about here is social and ecological well-being, and that's the sort of ultimate sort of yardstick we should be using to measure whether or not our policies on climate change are appropriate and successful. And then, this sort of more recent thinking is, this notion, my concern that, one of the big arguments for aggressive climate action is to protect the most vulnerable, right? I fully believe that. I'm also quite convinced that it's the most vulnerable people in society that are often the first to bear the externalities or unintended consequences of policy interventions. And so that's the notion of the sort of title of this talk, the sort of paradox we have, whereas in our efforts to aggressively address the climate problem and essentially disrupting the system in the name of protecting the most vulnerable, it could very well be that it's the most vulnerable that lose out, at least in some dimensions, in that kind of scenario. And so if we're trying to avoid this paradox, it means thinking very, very carefully about our interventions to make sure we're sort of avoiding putting a burden on this population. As a colleague of mine, who I talked about this recently, who looks like me in terms of his complexion, and who works very much in the clean energy space, says, "Look, I really want to fight climate change, but I don't want to do that on the backs of people that look like me." And I think increasingly we're seeing concerns raised about, to what extent that might actually be happening. Okay, so this notion of sort of equity in terms of how we deal with this. So I want to dig into that and really sort of frame this in the context of justice, right? So if you paid any attention to climate change, at least since the last presidential election, the sort of notion of sort of broader social equity, social justice, and particularly in the climate context, has really gone mainstream, largely through the agenda of the Biden-Harris administration. They're now in the White House. So we've seen a range of initiatives from executive orders on environmental justice down to scientific assessments like the fifth National Climate Assessment, which just got started, and I'm working on the IPCC assessment. All of these are really taking a very strong line on the importance of equity and thinking about climate change and its implications. So this is, what we're talking about today increasingly when we talk about climate change. And it's actually easy to talk about the entire climate change problem as one that's driven by inequities in society and the economy and how we value things. But so that's mainstream, but we see it being talked about in different ways, right? This is a particular thing I'm interested in hearing from others about. I did a scan of how I see this sort of topic of climate justice being framed. And I came up with sort of a typology of 3 different ways. And this is based upon 15 odd minutes of thinking about it probably last night. So there might be many others. But for me, the most common one we talk about this is this notion of differential vulnerability. And this is something we've been talking about with climate change for as long as I've been working on climate change, which is this notion that it's the most vulnerable among us who stand to be disproportionately adversely affected by climate change. And therefore, climate justice is about protecting the most vulnerable, which, at least in this country, tends to be marginalized communities and communities of color. And I was validated in this morning when this NASA workshop that I was in, where they define climate justice really specifically in this context. It's sort of differential vulnerability, more vulnerable populations. That's the focus if we're trying to concentrate on climate justice. And look, I'm all about that. As a brief aside, so I'm doing other work in the climate justice domain, if that's how we're talking about climate justice. We have a project at RAND that's getting ready to be released, which is looking at historical redlining or discriminatory practices in housing in the United States from decades ago, and how these historical practices of discrimination affect current day exposure to extreme heat, flooding, and other types of environmental hazards. So we built up an online tool that's going to allow people to go and explore sort of differential exposure to different types of hazards across 200 cities in the US. specifically to look at this question of how differential vulnerability created by historical discrimination sort of exists across the country today and shapes exposure. So that is a fundamental component of climate justice. But the other way it's talked about is in the context of historical responsibility. And this is also been a common theme, particularly in the debate between the global north or the wealthy countries and the global south, the developing world, about effectively why should developing countries bear the burden of dealing with the climate challenge when it was the rich, wealthy, developed countries that created the problem in the first place. And that leads to, this is sort of an active, a really active arena in international negotiations. And the idea that that the developed world should effectively be compensating the developing world for climate change consequences. Obviously, developed countries don't like this idea of being on the hook for paying for climate damages in other countries. But if those of you are familiar with Bill McKibben, who's one of the more famous sort of environmentalists and authors in the US and in the world, had a recent opinion just this past week where he basically argues that this is exactly what developed countries should be doing, is paying for the losses that occur in developing countries from climate change, under the argument that it's actually undermining climate change, is undermining their development, and they're not historically responsible. Within the policy arena, international policy arena, there's actually a specific mechanism called the Warsaw International Mechanism, which is essentially a provision in the Paris Agreement that says the developed world will support and assist developing countries in dealing with what's called loss and damage. That's effectively the consequences of climate change. And to date, this is limited to, enhancing knowledge about climate change and risk management, building dialogues, and enhancing action, et cetera. The kinds of things that Greta Thunberg might say are blah, 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 as opposed to developed countries committing to, large payments to developing world. But so if I say this is another dimension that's very active in the policy arena in terms of talking about climate justice. But what I really want to focus on is this third dimension I raised, which is this idea of just transitions. And I want to introduce this other concept that I call goal substitution, which I think is one way of sort of summing up what I'm trying to get at. Okay, so let's go back to this idea that dealing with the climate change challenge in 10 years is going to be disruptive, and that disruption might fall disproportionately on those who are most vulnerable. So this is an analysis looking at sort of what's called sort of the energy burden. You can think of it as sort of household income that's allocated toward energy bills, right? In the United States, and it's divided in different groups. So the blue bars are looking at energy burden across different income levels. The red bars are looking at energy burden across different housing types. The orange bars are about race, ethnicity, et cetera. So, quickly what you see is if you look at low-income households, whether it's low-income households with older adults, low-income households with children, et cetera, those households are already facing a very large energy burden right now today, based upon prevailing energy technologies and policies. If we look at racial and ethnic groups, we see Native American communities, Black communities, Hispanic communities also paying a disproportionate amount. If we look at different housing types, sort of low income manufactured homes, again, facing a higher energy burden, and even older Americans facing a higher energy burden. So given this, what happens when you transform the energy economy overnight, retire a bunch of existing capital stock in the energy sector, odds are you're going to drive up the costs of energy. And those costs are not going to be borne equally by different groups, because energy costs aren't borne equally right now by different groups. So this becomes an unintended consequence or an externality of climate policy, unless you develop mechanisms for offsetting additional energy costs or compensating people for energy costs. Now, these might only be short-term increases in energy costs. When we arrive at a new energy future that's all renewable and inexpensive, maybe things actually look more equitable anyway. But again, the process of getting there is going to be a disruptive, right? And it even boils down to simple things. Again, sort of my colleague that works in this area, when you talk about individual technologies and who those technologies work for, the types of housing new emerging technologies work for, whether it's heat pump water heaters or other types of highly efficient appliances that are designed to help us achieve energy efficiency and reduce energy demand. Those types of innovations and technologies, might be more expensive, and they actually might be designed to work better in large new suburban homes with low occupancy, as opposed to small multifamily housing with lots of people living in them, right? So again, how well are the solutions we're pursuing? How well do they match sort of the needs of real people in the real world? They're going to bear the burden. So that's kind of the challenges we're worried about on the sort of energy front. But we can also look at this from a resilience front. So the other thing we're trying to do is, how do we protect people, infrastructure, ecosystems from climate change impacts? And so these are a relatively recent analysis looking at buyback programs for houses and properties that are repeatedly flooded, which tend to be in either flood-prone areas or sort of coastal areas that are flooded by hurricanes. And so what we see here is most of the properties that become eligible or offered buybacks tend to occur in urban areas, which is the sort of dark blue shading, with much smaller fractions in suburban or rural areas. Now, part of this is not a surprise, because you just have higher density in urban areas, more housing in urban areas, so you're going to get larger numbers. But nevertheless, what it means is, the bulk of this is federal money flowing into buyback programs is flowing into urban areas. And then if you look within those urban areas and look at sort of census tracts that are predominantly comprised of non-white households versus census tracts that are predominantly comprised of white households, what you see is a disparity with the probability of a buyback being offered to a households in a predominantly white census tract tend to be several fold higher than the probability of offering that buyback to a non-white community or household. So here we are in the resilience space. How do we use policy to help reduce future vulnerability, retreat from the coastline, avoid repetitive losses? But even here, we're seeing benefits of policies designed to promote resilience flowing disproportionately to some populations versus others. And at the end of the day, you better believe this has implications for well-being in terms of how people are affected after a disaster, the likelihood that people are going to be displaced from their homes and have to move elsewhere, loss of income, loss of livelihoods, stress, mental anxiety about concerns that, my house is going to be flooded every other year indefinitely because I'm struggling to get a buyback from the federal government. So those are sort of two examples in detail, but sort of the broader issue. So what does this all mean, and where am I going with this? Is the sort of notion of, how I describe the big concern I have is this sort of notion of goal substitution, which what I'm referring to is sort of situation when decision makers become preoccupied with mechanisms for achieving outcomes rather than the outcomes that they actually want to achieve. So, for example, sum it up bluntly, are we concerned about, so for me, another way of putting this is, I view climate change as a problem, and a problem we're concerned about because of its implications for human well-being, the well-being of natural ecosystems, right? I am less concerned about the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or atmospheric temperatures, or sea level as a thing. I'm concerned about what those things mean for human and natural systems. But what I see is when we talk about things like this, the images are designed to sort of refer to this, we talk about carbon capture and storage technology, right? So a technology that's not at all mature, that we're going to be investing large amounts of money in trying to promote, including in the current administration that's allocating money to this. And the question becomes one about, well, is that the best way to promote human well-being, by spending large amounts of money trying to take carbon dioxide, out of the atmosphere, for example? The middle picture is around land-based carbon sequestration. Is the best way to deal with the climate problem and promote well-being to plant as many trees as we possibly can, despite the potential implications for disrupting natural ecosystems, right? There's a whole literature on this. Or, taking farmland that would grow crops and food for people and planting biomass for energy generation. Or the big topic right now, everybody's talking about, slightly different context, nuclear power. So we're seeing nuclear power plants being turned off as aggressively as possible around the world, while at the same time, we're trying to aggressively reduce our emissions, right? So here we're substituting the goal of human and ecological well-being for getting rid of nuclear power as quickly as possible, right? And so, so we see these things playing out right now around the world. And the issue of focusing on these sort of near-term proximal goals is it creates the risk of maladaptation and exacerbating inequities, or even exacerbating ecological challenges. And to bring this closer to home, we see some of the things playing out at the local level. So in California, we have new mandate, the new housing has to have sort of rooftop solar generation on it. It's a great way of expanding rooftop generation. That is a great way of dealing with the climate change challenge. It also is going to increase the cost of a home in a state that already has some of the highest home costs anywhere in the country, right? Green infrastructure, both as a way of avoiding gray infrastructure to deal with climate-related challenges like urban flooding, also adding scenic amenity. But it also raises the issue of green gentrification, right? Is that a thing, or is that not a thing? And to what extent should we be concerned about it? And this is a challenge we specifically are talking about: greening communities to help bring down temperatures, to make them more resilient to a changing climate. But if you end up driving up rents and displacing people in the process, because you've made that community much nicer for people who are more affluent to live in, have you improved the situation for the most vulnerable? And the last one, bike paths, which I enjoy, and that's actually my own photograph of my own bicycle on a bike path. There's this sort of interesting debate about, for whom are bike paths being deployed within urban environments, and you're seeing very heated debates about the merits of bike paths, which are promoted as a sustainability measure, active transport, health benefits, reducing car trips, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but you're also spending money building infrastructure that some would argue is benefiting a certain segment of society, but not society writ large. And who is really asking for bike paths? And we see this debate playing out in Washington, D.C., playing out here. I saw it play out in Knoxville, Tennessee, where I used to live. So, so I'm just pointing these things out just because, particularly for those, who are students and sort of studying public health, studying well-being, and particularly interested in environmental health, trying to sort of, get your brains thinking about, what are the goals we're trying to accomplish? Because we're never trying to accomplish just one goal. Almost invariably, we're trying to push on multiple fronts at the same time. But to do that, we have to be cognizant of how our actions in one place are creating externalities elsewhere. And this is not just sort of a researcher thing. You're seeing this stuff play out time and time again in the media, where people are raising questions about carbon capture and storage. Like, what are the implications of that? If all we're doing with that is continuing and extending the use of fossil fuels, that actually could be problematic in terms of promoting health and well-being. I've talked about, California's plans to, do rooftop solar as well as electrify buildings. Invariably, that's going to drive up costs that somebody has to bear. Issues around labor, who gets to benefit from the jobs going to be created in implementing these big transitions, right? Is it low-income workers, low-income marginalized communities? Is it people of color? They're going to be on rooftops, building green roofs and installing solar panels. And if not, then when we talk about the job benefits of an energy transition, are we being honest about who's going to benefit from all those jobs, right? Or the fact that creating a lot of jobs is also creating a lot of people that have to get paid, which means we're creating a lot of costs. Again, somebody has to bear. So these kind of debates are sort of popping up all over the place. And so just keep your eyes open for these. And then lastly, just want to talk about sort of, how I think about some of the stuff playing out in the research domain. And I sort of view it and sort of thinking about three different research, orientations or ways to run with research. And this is borrowing, so I lied. So this is borrowing from another paper of mine from a few years ago. But so one, we can think about for the need to do research about equity, about climate justice. And this is things like, doing this work we're doing with Redline, trying to document inequities and disparities as they exist now, or particularly in terms of policy interventions, trying to define what the driving forces are that are creating inequities and sort of identifying what the solution space might look like. Another orientation is for research for justice, or research that actually promotes justice and equity. And so this would be sort of research that's about disseminating knowledge and tools that give people resources and effectively power to pursue their own goals and agendas. It's about, doing research that results in on-the-ground implementation, or evaluating things that are already being done to sort of learn what works and what doesn't work. And then the last research orientation is what I call sort of reflexive research, which is basically just sort of thinking critically about how we do research as researchers, and questioning some of the assumptions that we have. And I think this whole talk is sort of designed to question, conventional thinking or conventional assumptions about the costs and benefits of different types of intervention. And I think, that's all I was going to share. So hopefully that leaves a bit of time for questions or comments. I'm just curious to hear from anyone and everyone who wants to chirp up in a few minutes to share their thoughts. So thanks.
Great. Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Preston. So we can stop the recording.